Give me one more look.
Alrighty, I think we are good. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our speaker series at the Fields House Museum. My name is Nicole, and I am really excited today to be introducing Dr. Rafia Zafar, who is a professor at Washington University. Today, she will be discussing her book, We Wear the Mask, American Literature, 1760 to 1870. A little bit about Dr. Zafar. She received her degree from the City College in New York, a BA in English. She received an MA in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University and a Ph.D. in History and American Civilization from Harvard. Before joining Washington University, before joining the Washington University in the departments of English and African American Studies and programs in American Cultural Studies, she's a professor at the University of Michigan. Currently, Dr. Zafar is the faculty director of Washington University's Mellon Undergraduate Fellowship Program. Dr. Zafar herself has received many fellowships from places such as the Ford Foundation, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Virginia Center for Humanities. And in 2007, she held the Walt Whitman Distinguished Fulbright Chair at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I hope I pronounced that right. And in 2014 to 2015, she was the National Endowment for the Humanities Scholar in Residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. Dr. Zafar has written many books over her career and has worked in editing them as well. Attributed to her are Recipes for Respect, African American Meals and Meaning, which appeared in 2019 and was reviewed by the Wall Street Journal and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It is currently still receiving a lot of attention, so be sure to look out for different podcasts and radio broadcasting, as well as articles to learn more about that book. She has also been included with major publications, including God Made Man, Man Made the Slave, Harriet Jacobs and the Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, New Critical Essays, the book We Wear the Masks, African Americans Write American Literature, 1760 to 1870, which she'll be discussing today, and the Harlem Renaissance novels, the Library of America collection. Her administrative profile at Washington University has included the Director of Programs in African American Studies from 1999 to 2003, and the Director of Undergraduate Honors in the Department of English from 2007 to 2010. From 2011 to 2014, she served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusiveness in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, where she directed the Chancellor's Graduate Fellowship Program, aimed at increasing the number of underrepresented groups in academic positions, and worked to expand and develop other minority recruitment and diversity initiatives for the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Her commitment to the graduate education began as a member of the MLA Ad Hoc Committee on the Professionalism of the Ph.D. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Zafar.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a glowing introduction. It's always funny to hear people talk about you. So I will talk about other people. I was asked, it's funny, this was my first solely authored book. That was my third book. And I was asked to talk about the book, how I came to be doing this book, what it's like to be, a nonfiction writer. And also, I thought, in honor of the Field Museum being the home of a St. Louis writer, I would spend some time in a little while talking about two well-known, at least to those of us in 19th century literature, two African-American authors of the 19th century. And then we can have some questions. So let me begin. So my path to the professoriate was, I think, fairly typical for most American academics. I was a nerdy girl. When I went to summer camp, I did not want to ride horses. I did not want to swim. I wanted to sit on the steps of the bunk and read books. Um, but occasionally they would drag me out and I would have to do these things. So nerdy girls grow up to be English majors, and that's even though I went to a math and science high school in New York City. I am from New York City. Some of you may be able to detect a whisper of a New York accent from time to time, but that accent was moderated by my mother. My mother was from Michigan, which is actually where my first academic job was. So I will sometimes sound like a Michigander and I sometimes sound like a New Yorker. And most of the time I probably sound like a little bit of each. I don't think I've acquired a St. Louis accent. I've been here at Washington University since 1998. And I've lived in University City in this house the entire time. We moved from Ann Arbor, where I met my husband, who was retired from Washington University. Okay, so how did I get into literary studies? Well, when I was in college, I started actually out in art school, and then I transferred to English to a different school where I was a creative writing minor. So I studied with some people were pretty well known writers, but writing in, I admire the people I study. Writers, it's a hard life. It's often an unstructured life. I found it a little easier after a while to think about writing. And I worked in book publishing for 6 years at Doubleday and Company, the publisher, the trade book publisher for 4 years. And then I worked at Book of the Month Club, the book club, which kind of was in hiatus for a while, but it's come back. And it was a great job, right? Because what I read all day. I mean, they were paying me to read all day and then to talk about what I was reading. So I thought, we're at the pinnacle here. But then after a while, people started asking me in my 20s whether I was a teacher, because not only did I like reading books and talking about them, I would want to talk to people outside of the office about the books I read. So people kept saying, are you a teacher? And I'd say no. And I'd say, well, you sound like a teacher. I thought, So long story short, I ended up in grad school. And first, for those of you who are interested in that path, I decided to do a master's first, which I don't necessarily recommend because generally you have to pay money for your master's. If you go on to a doctoral program, a well-established doctoral program, say like at WashU or like at Harvard where I went, if you're admitted, you end up essentially getting paid to be a student. So I thought that was the best thing in the world. Be a student, read books, talk to other people about books. But at a certain point, you realize they're going to ask you to do something which you've never done before, and that's write a book or write a dissertation. And so I'd written short stories before, I'd written nonfiction pieces, but I'd never written a dissertation. My grad students now will say, ooh, Dr. Z, writing I don't think I can write a dissertation. So, well, you've written seminar papers, 25, 30 pages. Well, yes, I've done that. I said, then you can write a dissertation. Because a dissertation you can think of as a collection of 5, 6 essays. And then you put them together. You should establish a through line, right? What is the argument of the book, of the manuscript? And then you proceed. So you do that, then you become a professor. These days, it's a lot harder. And those of us know it's not just the pandemic. It's also Universities are structured differently than when I was starting, and even certainly than when my advisors were getting started. So that without going into the boring minutia of academic positions, there are fewer full-time positions than there used to be. I think that kind of contracting is going on in labor markets, all kinds of places, but people don't usually think about them in terms of academia. So when you write a dissertation, one of the things your advisors will say is pick a topic that will keep you interested for a long time. And then also one that you will not only stay interested enough to spend 2 or 3 years on in graduate school, because graduate school is generally 5 or 6 years, but that you will then, if you're going into what I was just mentoring a junior colleague, what's a book discipline, in order to get tenure, right? That means essentially a permanent position at a place like Washington University. And I'll bracket that. My mother used to say, well, once you have tenure, you can't get fired. And people will say that, but it's not true. It's difficult, but it's kind of like being unionized, right? It's people who belong to a union are unlikely to get fired or laid off, but it can happen, right? If you don't do what you're asked to do. So anyway, I revised my book, and there it is, written in, this was essentially another version of my dissertation, and somewhere around there I have my dissertation. So why did I write? Why did I write about African American? Well, that's a complicated question, and it's not necessarily as obvious as you might think, right? Because I could have gone into everything else. And actually, my most recent book, it can be categorized as a history book, right? It's been reviewed actually to this date exclusively in history journals. Ms. Meyer noted that I have a Ph.D. in the history of American civilization, which is actually a joint doctorate in American literature and American history. So you can think of me as a switch hitter. I can bat with my right hand or I can bat with my left hand. So I write history, I write literature. Well, I actually think of myself as a literary and cultural historian. So what about that first book? Why did I write it? Well, in some ways it does go back to my youth, a different part of my youth, not thinking about books so much, but about living for a time in Harlem, which I hope people know, as it was a Black Mecca in New York City. Like, I guess a close thing would be Bronzeville in Chicago for us Midwesterners. But it was really the Ville in the old days, right? When Homer G was there, and you had, it was a vibrant place. But I lived with my grandmother and my father for a while. And I remember talking to my grandmother about what Harlem used to be like. I don't know what got us on the subject. And we were looking out of the back window of our apartment one day, and it was what we call in New York tar beach. We could see all the tar beaches, meaning the tar roofs of all the buildings stretching on down the hill. And my grandmother said, when I came here, it was all fields. And that blew my mind as a little city kid. I mean, I didn't grow up in New York City. And I asked her about that. And she said, well, Harlem wasn't always Harlem. I thought, well, Harlem wasn't, it's what I knew. I remember walking and seeing they were Italian folks, 2 guys who had the vegetable market in our neighborhood. And I remember asking my grandmother, I said, because everyone else I knew in the neighborhood was African American. I said, well, why are they here, Grandma? And she said, well, they run the vegetable store. And she said another thing about Harlem. She said, Harlem, not everyone who lives in Harlem is Black. I should say, I would say that. My grandmother would never have used Black. She would have said colored or Negro. I don't even, I think even African American was probably too newfangled for her. But she came up from Virginia in sometime before the First World War. She was always very cagey, telling me when she came up because she didn't want me to figure out how old she was. And indeed, I still to this day, and she's passed away. She passed away in 1982. I'm still not quite sure how old she was because she swore her siblings to secrecy, and they didn't tell me either. And when I was asking questions about Harlem, and she was telling me what she knew about Harlem. And then when I went to grad school and college, I learned about this magical time called the Harlem Renaissance. So I thought, Harlem Renaissance. Wow, that's Harlem. So I went to my grandmother, and I was in college at that point, and I said, well, tell me about places like the Cotton Club. And she laughed and she said, well, you couldn't go to the Cotton Club if you showed color, meaning if you were brown skinned. She said, you could work there. She said, but you couldn't go there as a patron. So I thought that was places in Harlem that were segregated. And she might say, well, they wouldn't necessarily be segregated on color, but the patronage was for people from outside of Harlem. She's talking about Prohibition, right? In the 1920s, there were jazz clubs, there were speakeasies, and a lot of them were in Harlem. And people would go, people who were European American, white people would go who had money, who wanted to have a night out on the town and probably not be seen by a lot of their more buttoned up friends, their more law abiding friends. But just started getting more and more interesting. So I found out that there were all these writers in the 1920s, African American writers. Now, one I really had heard of, Jean Toomer, and then there were these others that I had never heard of before. And we're not talking about James Baldwin or Richard Wright. I knew about them, knew about Gwendolyn Brooks, knew about Langston Hughes. And I heard that Langston Hughes was one of these Harlem Renaissance writers. And he was really close with a Black woman writer named Zora Neale Hurston. And there was, all this population of interesting writers. And I wanted to know more about them. So when I started grad school, I thought, I want to write about the Harlem Renaissance. So I started studying them and wrote one of my master's essays on one of the novelists, a woman named Jessie Fawcett, who was also the editor of a magazine called The Crisis, which is still published today. It was what they call the house organ, the magazine of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded in part by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was their editor. And also one of those writers I learned about not in high school, but in college. I knew about Langston Hughes because my mother told me about Langston Hughes. I learned a lot about American writers from my mother because she was a reader. She loved reading. She probably read every book, or I think she did, in the South Haven, Michigan library where she grew up. And she didn't go to college. My sister and I always tried to talk her into going to college late, but she didn't think she could. Although my mother would take us to the library across the street, and we'd fill up our shopping cart with books and come back, and a week later we'd return all those books and bring back another set. So that's another reason I ended up being one of those nerdy girls, because my mother was a nerdy girl. But in her generation, in her class, right, her family was not well off. They didn't, girls were not often college educated because they were just going to be married, right, and have children. So what was the use of a girl going to college? That's a subject for another. My grandmother, the grandmother I lived with, my father's mother, I don't even know whether she ever finished high school. I don't even know whether she went to high school. I don't even know whether we ever had that conversation, come to think of it. She just was. My grandmother was just this wonderful presence. Anyway, So Harlem Renaissance. What is a Renaissance? You start when you're in school, you're encouraged to ask questions. And I always was one of those kids who asked a lot of questions. So I thought if there was a Renaissance, what came before the Renaissance? I knew some of what came after, right? I knew about the James Baldwins and the Gwendolyn Brookses, the Richard Wrights, because we read them in high school. In New York City high schools, I went to met a school that's, I guess, an equivalent kind of school would be Metro in St. Louis, a school where it's a competitive school to get into, to be a student there. So we had great teachers, and even though the idea was for, I guess, to turn out future scientists and doctors, I was not particularly interested in being a scientist or a doctor, but it was one of the, it was a college, the students who went there, it was like 99.9% of us went on to college. I mean, if you went to my high school, you went to college. It wasn't even an argument. But still, I didn't know about the Harlem Renaissance in high school. And I just started learning about it really in grad school. Because in college, I had one class in Black literature, which covered everyone from someone like Derek Walcott, right? He's a Caribbean poet, a wonderful writer, to, say, James Baldwin. He was taught by a James Baldwin scholar, Stanley McCabe, who's since passed away, who was from Nigeria. So, it's not like there were a lot of courses on the books, but I started learning about them. And I thought, this is really, it combines my interest in where I grew up and wanting to know, sort of the intellectual history of this storied neighborhood that I lived in for a time. But still, if there's a Renaissance, right? I was reading all these great writers. There had to be something before the Renaissance, right? Otherwise, why was it a Renaissance, right? Renaissance. Why was it a rebirth? If there was a rebirth, something had to come before. So what was before? I'm trying to look at my notes here. Here we go. The 19th century was before. The Harlem Renaissance, generally, when we're being boring academics and talk about something called periodization, that means during what time did people paint? During what time did people write? During what time did certain things happen, right? The Great Depression. People might, periodize that generally by 1929, the crash of the stock market. And the end was the United States entry into the war. I'm talking about the American Depression, right? And those are sort of the boundaries of it. People, sometimes it's easier. Historians can say, this really started it with the stock market crash. This really ended it. Maybe not so clear cut with, like, when do you say America might have entered the war, but wasn't America already ramping up in terms of support for the Allies before the official entry into the war? Similarly, the Harlem Renaissance. Most people pitch it from around the end of the First World War, around 1919, 1920, to about 1935. But it's looser. The end of it is often said to be the absolute end was the infamous Harlem Riot of 1935. But also people said things started happening again with the fall of the stock market. But in those, say, 10 years after the First World War and before the stock market, all of a sudden, you can say all of a sudden, but it wasn't all of a sudden, all of these people were getting published. What white publishers were becoming interested in this whole group, this growing number. What you're seeing is the increase in the African-American educated middle class and upper class. And when you have the leisure and the money, you can send your children to school, you can send them to college, they can read books, they can start writing books, right? If you're busily worrying about like just getting by, you know, you don't necessarily have time or the inclination. So anyway, there's all these great writers, but I thought there's got to be something before that. So when I was in grad school, when I then went on for my doctorate, I worked with a couple of scholars, both of whom worked in that period before 1900. And they kept pushing me. They said, why don't you keep reading? Keep going back. And I did. So what did I find? Okay, I'm going to look at my notes again, take off my glasses. Who were the Harlem Renaissance writers reading, right? They had to have been reading someone, I thought. So who were they reading? People like Charles Chesnutt. People like, some of you may know, Paul Laurence Dunbar. People like Francis E.W. Harper, who's a poet and a novelist. Dunbar was largely known for his poetry, but also wrote fiction. Chesnutt was known for some incredible and really incredible short stories and novels. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. So I started reading them. And then I realized how far back do writers in, American writers of African descent, how far back do they go? And pretty much you stop if you're looking at published books. The first book by an African American was written by someone named Phyllis Wheatley, who was a poet who was kidnapped and carried across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage. And she arrived in Boston as this little girl about, we're not even sure how old she was. She couldn't speak English. They figured how old she was because she was missing her front teeth. So you figured she's around 6, 7. And for whatever reasons, the people who purchased her realized, they paid attention to who she was. They paid attention and noticed that she was a really bright little girl, and that she was interested in listening to people and reading, and she wanted to read. And I guess her owners were not good slave owners in that sense, as they allowed her to read and become literate. And she published her first poem, I learned, when she was still a teenager. And her first book of poetry, the first book of poetry or any book published by someone of African descent who was an American, was in 1773, when she was possibly 20 years old, but could also have been 19, again, because she really didn't know how old she was. There was no one for her to ask. They just guessed. That book was published not in the United States, because the printing industry, the publishing industry, in 1773, let's remember, the United States was still part of England. So her book was actually literally published in England. Anyway, finding out about Phyllis Wheatley, and then when I was during the introduction, you may have heard me say I'm an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society, which is this fantastic library and museum of the first 100 years of the United States, sort of literature and historical documents. And once when I was there, I said, is there a copy of the Phyllis Wheatley volume? It's called Poems on Religious Subjects. And they had it, and I think I had gloves on, right? And you read things that are that old, often in something called a book cradle, because they don't want you hurting the spine of the book. And reading the poems was really, really incredible, right? To think that this is a document that's old. These are what nerdy girls and nerdy boys tend to get excited about. It's like reading old books. But I thought, well, there's not that much at the end of the 18th century. By the 19th century, you're starting to see more books by people of African descent, or more writing. But it's still pretty rare. Why, you might ask? Well, because it was illegal in many states, most states, certainly in the South, for African Americans to read and write. It was seen as dangerous. You did not want people who you were captive, who were holding captive and forcing you to work for them to have literacy skills. And this was an interesting problem because on the other hand, people often, the owners, the putative owners, the whites who kept people hostage, often wanted them to be Christian, right? Because they thought that would be good. Now, what's the problem? Particularly if you're a Protestant. If you're a Protestant, you are supposed to read, right? You're supposed to read and interpret the scriptures for yourself. But that would be a dangerous thing, right? Reading the Old Testament would be a very dangerous thing, right? It's one of the connections between sort of African Americans in the United States and like the Old Testament, right? Because the Old Testament, there's a lot about slavery and there's a lot about escaping from slavery. So a lot of Bible reading, not necessarily encouraged. And there was even a split in the Episcopal Church in the late 18th, early 19th century, because people like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen said, if we are all Episcopalians, why are you treating us differently? Why are you saying that we can't take communion at the same time? Why do we have to sit in a different part of the church? So there's very complicated things going on about Christianity and literacy, and the sort of the prevention of literacy kept the numbers of people who could write books down. But it didn't eliminate them because there were states and there were people who would flaunt the law. Somebody would say, who say owned me and said, I want Rafia to be able to go to the store if I give her money and I want her to do marketing. I don't want her to be cheated. I want her to be able to read the signs so she knows which is the butcher and which is the baker. So some whites thought, a little bit of learning wasn't a bad thing. But Frederick Douglass, who was maybe one of the most famous, he certainly, with Walt Whitman, he was one of the two most photographed men in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery around 1818 in Maryland. Frederick Douglass said, if you give someone an inch, they will take an L, right? So you let people start learning letters and words, they're going to start wanting to string those words together and read. And once they could read words like abolition. And he thought, what was that word abolition? And abolition meant getting rid of slavery. So he knew even as a young slave, I don't want to tell people I know what that word means. But it sort of it made him determined to learn how to read and write. So that's all happening before the Civil War. The two people I thought, I'm keeping an eye on the time, the two people I wanted to focus on for a few minutes, unlike Douglass, were actually St. Louisans. Neither of them were born in St. Louis, but they spent a lot of time here. So they overlapped with the Charles Chestnut, at least Elizabeth Keckley did. Elizabeth Keckley lived a very long time, and she overlapped with Du Bois and Dunbar and Harper. William Wells Brown, who lived in St. Louis, around St. Charles, much longer, was also a 19th century person. So let me tell you a little bit about these guys. I'm going to find my notes because the way I won't get too well. Oh, I wanted to show you one thing. There's this guy, The Colored Aristocracy. That might be the first sort of book about Black St. Louisans. It was published in 1858, and it's actually just a pamphlet. It was edited by the historian Julie Winch. But Glamorgan, some of you who are St. Louisans will recognize the name of the Glamorgans, who were this big, we would now call it a mixed race clan, right? White fur trappers, Native Americans, African Americans, some free, some slave. And they have this big family. And Cyprian was one of the ones who was well off. He had a business and he took it upon himself. He was going to write like a social register of African Americans in the 19th century. So he would have entries like William Johnson Jr., a nephew of the last name, keeps a coffee house for colored people on the corner of Washington Avenue and 7th Street. He is something of a talker and pretends to know a great deal. Like his uncle, he is proud and aristocratic, but a good businessman. He has made some $10,000 and is very fond of money. He has an accomplished wife and is in good standing in society. So Glamorgan's kind of cool because, you know, if you go through the book, some of those families are still here. And some of them, who knows where they went, if their families stopped reproducing or if they just moved away. So I had to put in a little thing for Cyprian Glamorgan for those of you who are real long-time St. Louisans. The people I wanted you, though, to know a little bit more about is Elizabeth Keckley, who was born in 1818 and lived to 1907. She lived a long, long time. And William Wells Brown, who, like a lot of people who were born into slavery, never really did find out how old he was. He was born around 1814 or 1815, and he lived to 1880. So I want to show you something that is really cool, because Elizabeth Keckley wrote a book called Behind the Scenes at the White House, or 30 Years a Slave, and 4 in the White House. It's the story of her life and her friendship, right? Her life as a slave, and then later on, her life in the White House, because she is someone who literally sewed her way to freedom. She was, let me see if I have to rely, and she was born in Virginia, so my grandmother would like that. She was brought first to North Carolina and then to St. Louis, probably around 1847. And a white man, probably the putative owner of her family, was probably her father. She supported the white family who then claimed her by her sewing skills. She was a phenomenal seamstress, which she'd learned from her mother. And she was so good at it that not only was she supporting this family of about, I mean, a lot of the money they were getting was from Elizabeth Keckley, but she talked them into letting her buy her own freedom and her freedom of her son. And her son was the result of the rape, multiple times rape of one of the white men she was forced to work for. What she did, though, is she ended up, I'm going to do a shared screen because I have to show you this. Here we go. Let me see. This top 2. All right, I'm having my little. There. All right, I want to show you this, but I'm not for some reason. So I'm going to not share it and see if I can get back to it. There, are we seeing it now? I don't know whether you can see it, but I think you are seeing it. I hope you are, not my notes. And that is a purple dress. If you can't see it, it's a purple dress that Elizabeth Keckley designed and made for Mary Todd Lincoln. She became one of her closest friends. At the same time, her skills were so phenomenal that she ended up employing about 20 people. I mean, she had this dressmaking and design business in Washington, D.C., and she became well known because her first dress was for none other than the wife of Robert E. Lee. And her dress was just a sensation at whatever Washington Society ball. And everyone was saying, who did that dress? And she said, oh, it was Elizabeth Keckley. So that was pretty cool. Anyway, Behind the Scenes is a wonderful book. I recommend it. And I think you can't see the screen. Could you see the screen at the end? I hope you can.
screen that we saw was the full computer screen,
Oh, rats.
the dress or anything.
Thank you. You couldn't see the dress. I'm going to try. Should I try again? Because it's a beautiful dress. Let me see.
Yeah, maybe if it's
There it is. This should happen. How's that?
yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. All righty. I'm going to see, because I can't see you looking at, like, my class looking at me and with cross eyes saying, Dr. Z, I cannot see anything. This is a beautiful dress. It's in the Smithsonian. And actually there are a few dresses that she made. This is an incredible dress too, because she had what you could think of, you can see the body of it. The bottom of it is this beautiful velvet, and the top looks sort of buttoned up, but you could switch out the top for an evening outfit, and then it was sort of cut lower, and there was laciness on the sleeves, and it was really, really beautiful. She was such an accomplished seamstress. And there's even a quilt, and I can't remember what museum the quilt's in, that is made from sort of the little bits of these fabulous fabrics she was working in. So it's interesting though that she was famous as a designer, but sort of what made her infamous in white society was what they thought was her, I don't know, her uppityness by writing a tell-all about her life with Mary Todd Lincoln. She insisted to the end it was because she was trying to help Lincoln, who actually became destitute. The Republican Party the then Republican Party took its time helping her out after Lincoln was assassinated. So since she had all these fabulous clothes, she thought she would sell them. And that just was a complete scandal, because I suppose people are gossips, and, there are tabloids attacking, Meghan Markle today, and there were tabloids attacking Mary Todd Lincoln then. And, I guess she was just supposed to pine away in a destitute widow of the president. They eventually came around, but it was a whole snap. And even though they said that their friendship survived, it really was never the same after that. And that's because Keckley thought she was doing the right thing. And I see I have a few minutes to tell you about William Wells Brown, who was born he's an interesting guy. He was born around 1814 or 15. He was originally from Kentucky. And he refers to the man in his autobiography as the man who stole me when I was born. And he was moved from Kentucky to around St. Charles when he was a very little guy. He spent about 20 years in the St. Louis area. One of the things that's notable for us St. Louisans is that he worked for Elijah Lovejoy, who many of us know as the great abolitionist newspaperman in Alton, who was later murdered by pro-slavery terrorists. But for a while, William Wells Brown, as a slave, was hired out to Lovejoy, who treated him very well, and likely is the person who helped Brown become the sort of the reader and the writer he became. Of all the 19th century, other than maybe Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown is probably the person who you could say had a career as an author. He published multiple books. He went on speaking tours. He lived in England for a while because he was a fugitive slave. He was the first also, like Phyllis Wheatley, because his novel, Clotel, or The President's Daughter, which was a sort of a thinly veiled telling of the Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings story, was published first in England in 1853. So even though he was the first African-American novelist, the subject was so scandalous, it was published overseas, because at this point, England was pretty solidly abolitionist, and slavery had been ended over there, which is why many people, including Frederick Douglass, William and Ellen Craft, and many Americans who, the African-American authors of the 19th century and activists, many of them ended up in England for at least a while because it was safer for them. But to come back, many of them had to accept being purchased by their friends, who would then give them their free papers, because there was no way they could return to the US, because essentially there was a bounty on their head. So Clotel was a great success. He revised it and under slightly different names 2 times, but then went on to write travelogues and history of the African-American man. I think it's called The History of the Black Man. And one of the things I think we could put in, I'll try to put in the chat for everybody. Let's see, is a site called Documenting, there we go, Documenting the American South. And there you can find not only Keckley and Brown's works available for free for you to read online, but also the works of other 19th century Black authors like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. So I'll stop talking if people will ask me questions. And thank you for inviting me to revisit one of the sort of earliest parts of my career, both literally and figuratively. Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We did a few questions, and if anyone watching on Facebook has any questions, again, you can just post them in the comment section and we will ask them.
Okay.
One of the questions is, did the Glamorgan pamphlet cause any problems in St. Louis with its publication?
I think if it created problems, it was probably, it might have been among the people who got left out, who Glamorgan deemed not important enough, because remember, it's the colored aristocracy. So people who may have thought they were pretty well off, like, wait a minute, I'm not in here. How dare he leave me out? So there was probably all sorts of gossip and backbiting and stuff going on with the Glamorgan. But I haven't read it in a while, but when the Fieldhouse invited me to give this talk, I thought, right, let's not forget to tell them about Glamorgan. There's a great book by Julie Winch that's a history of the Glamorgan family, and the title of it is escaping me, but the editor's name is Julie Winch. She's a professor of history, and she loves St. Louis. She loves this really, before they had the word multicultural history, she really is fascinated by the multicultural history of St. Louis. And there's still some Glamorgans around. I heard tell, as my grandmother would say, but I haven't met any of them.
Another question we have is, have you researched journalists like Elizabeth Stewart?
Journalist, the African-American author or white author Elizabeth Stewart? No. The feminist?
Waiting for the person.
Oh, waiting for them.
Well, we'll see if Diane will clarify on her question which Elizabeth Stewart she is referring to. It's Stewart.
There was a Mariah Stewart who I've written about and I've thought about, who was an early Black writer in the 1820s. She is really kind of an amazing person. My students love her. Mariah Stewart was run out of Boston by, again, if you think about Glamorgan getting into hot water with all the people he didn't say were high-toned, Mariah Stewart was chased out of Boston by African-American men. So this is an early example of sexism, because she was probably the first American woman to speak promiscuously. And what that meant was a a woman speaking before a crowd of men and women together, not just a woman talking to an audience of women, but having the temerity to address a crowd of men and women. And the worst thing, as far as some of the sort of the male mukti mucks of Black Boston was, that she actually would tell people that they were lazy, they were spending too much money on dances, they should be good Christians, and what was important was being politically active and building institutions like schools. And people just thought she was, I guess she should stick to her knitting. But she ended up as an educator in New York. She's probably not on the Documenting the American South website, but you can find her works. It's called the Meditations of Mrs Stewart.
For clarification, the African American Elizabeth Stewart.
Pulling a blank. I believe it or not, I don't know everyone. Tell me more. Who is she? Maybe you'll ring a bell.
Another question, is the Wheatley book available online now?
Wheatley, yes, Wheatley would be. I would say and I'll put this in the chat, to look at either Project Gutenberg is probably the best. I don't know exactly what the website is, or the other one would be Kathy Trust. Those are two public domain sites that you can get all kinds of stuff for free. Where the American copyright law has rolling, what they call movement into the public domain. So 1920, I'm trying to think, Toomer is 1923. The Great Gatsby just went into the public domain. So everything published from the Great Gatsby backwards now can be digitized and available for free, or just reprinted and sold for profit. So Gutenberg and Hathy Trust, and probably some other websites, you'll be able to get the Phyllis Wheatley, and you might even, you'll be able to get the other books as well.
Into the public domain surprises me. That seems
What,
like
Gatsby?
Yeah.
It just went into the public domain. Yeah. And so Scribner's is going to be losing a lot of money, and the Fitzgerald family.
I wonder what that means for Walt Disney right now then. I think Mickey Mouse was 23 as well.
Yeah, well, if you talk to my husband, who's a retired film historian, a lot of the copyright law actually has to do with Disney, and Disney's lobbying up for certain restrictions on copyright. But he knows the details of that, and I don't.
A little bit of clarification on the Elizabeth Stewart.
Sure.
She and her husband were abolitionists, and she is mentioned at the Legacy Museum that Bryan Stevenson founded in Montgomery.
Ah, okay. Well, she was an author then?
I think it was a
journalist.
Yeah, a journalist.
Okay, right. Yeah. I tend to look at books, like people who publish in books. There's a great, these, if you love African American literature before a certain time, these are great times. I would say to look at, let me see, there's, I think, I wrote the Black Periodicals Project, which my colleague, Dr. Mariama Graham at the University of Kansas was instrumental in launching. And so you might be able to find the writings of Elizabeth Stewart there. There's just a lot of stuff, floating around. If Elizabeth Stewart, depending on when she was active, as they say, there's also something, you're getting me into professor mode now. There's something called the Colored Conventions Project, and I just put that up. And that is a fantastic resource. If you're interested in sort of intellectual activism in the 19th century, before Black folks could vote, of course we had political ideas and we had political beliefs, what do you do when you're not allowed part of the regular political process? You had conventions. Anyway, you had a Democratic convention, you have Republican conventions. There were things called the colored conventions, and they spanned almost the entire 19th century. And I wouldn't be surprised if you could find some of these. Well, I know you can find people like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown and Martin Delany at these conventions. You're not going to be surprised to find that there weren't necessarily a lot of women allowed at these conventions because of the prevailing belief in what they call the doctrine of the spheres, right? So there was the public sphere. That's where men were supposed to operate, right? In business, being out there. The private sphere was politics was the public sphere. The private sphere was moral and educational. And that was domestic, that was the sphere of women. So while women were not prevented from joining the colored conventions, their presence was much less. And they almost never were speakers. Frances E.W. Harper was one of the Black women we know was at the colored conventions, and the minutes and the speeches of the conventions were published. And if you go on the colored conventions website, you can look up, say, Missouri, and there'll be a digitized document with the proceedings of one of the conventions in Missouri or in Kentucky or in Boston. It's really cool.
Before we wrap up here, can you tell us a little bit about your most recent book, The Recipes for Respect, African American Meals and Meaning?
Oh, sure. I certainly go into the 19th century, because one of the things that kind of intrigues me is how did African Americans use literacy, not just, to read their Bibles, right? Well, that was important. But how did they use literacy as a means of accessing social mobility and civil rights and dignity? So I've been all from whether it's We Wear the Mask or Recipes for Respect, I'm very interested in the publications of Black entrepreneurs, the books that they wrote. So in Recipes for Respect, I look at Robert Roberts and Tunis Campbell, who were two Black men in the 1820s and 1840s, who were hospitality entrepreneurs who wrote books that sold well. So drawing on their position as, their knowledge as, butlers and hotel managers, and their literacy, so that, people now, like, people read Emily Post, they read Martha Stewart. How am I supposed to read right? You could look at Tunis Campbell's book and he'll tell you how to set the table. So before Martha Stewart, there was Tunis Campbell. Later on in the 19th century, there were people like Abby. I was actually teaching Abby Fisher today. I think I already put that aside. And then I go all the way up into the 20th century and look at Black Power, Black arts cookbooks in the 1970s. So again, I'm looking at how Black food, right? The eating, the production of it, the eating of it, the serving of it, the purchase or selling of it, and how how folks combine that with their literacy skills and the position of an author to leverage civil rights, social mobility, and respectability and dignity, in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, and for the presentation, for joining us here tonight. That was a wonderful hearing about everything and just learning more about people and where the movements of literature.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Diane, I think, who now will send me to look up the writings of Elizabeth Stewart. What's great is knowing that there's so many people who are, you now know names. I've learned somebody, right? So we can all go out and be nerdy and read. Thank you so much for inviting me.
For joining us, and we welcome you to come down to the Field House. And for everyone else, the Field House is open Wednesdays through Saturday 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and Sundays from noon to 4. We have a lot of wonderful exhibits right now. We do have our Power Boards exhibit, which is in collaboration with the St. Louis Black Authors of Children's Literature. It takes a look at African American and Black representation in children's literature. We have a wonderful exhibit with the Annie Malone Historical Society, who has put on an exhibit in our space there. And of course, we have our historic house. And you've given me a lot of great ideas for an exhibit coming this fall with St. Louis and Missouri writers, kind of a way to help celebrate the bicentennial.
That's right. It's bicentennial. Right.
So, yeah, thank you again. And in our Facebook comments, we're going to be trying to post some links so that way people can purchase both the We Wear the Masks as well as the
Recipes for Respect, which I have a copy. Who knows where it is? There are too many books on my desk. And as you can probably tell, there are a lot of books here. And this is only, I tell my students, these are only some of my books because this is just my home office. I have a whole lot of books in my English department office also. It's kind of a, what would you call it? It's a disease that
bibliomania.
What?
Bibliomania.
That's what it is. That's right.
Eugene Fields, the writer for our house, actually wrote Love Affairs of a Bibliomaniac back in it was published 1896. That was the last thing he finished. And just a downward spiral of a person who's collecting books.
I know it too well. I know it too well. I swore off buying books last year because we, thinking we'll be downsizing in a few years, but they keep creeping in.
Nowadays, I tell myself, ebooks don't count as physical books. It's okay to buy as many as I want.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you again for joining us. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And I will see you all maybe at the field house.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Take care.